For most of human history, conflict was brutal, but it was inexpensive. Not morally inexpensive, logistically inexpensive. Forces were composed of individuals who already existed. Arms were mostly instruments they already possessed. Campaigns were seasonal, brief, and constrained by geography and hunger. Monarchs didn't require accountants to fight conflicts. They required loyalty, horses, and period. Then, one invention transformed everything. Gunpowder didn't merely make conflict more destructive. It made conflict expensive. And once conflict became expensive, it ceased being a test of courage and became a test of finance. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where currency, authority, and history intersect. And nothing exists as straightforward as it appears. Before gunpowder, authority was fragmented. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of lords, vassals, and responsibilities. Forces were temporary. Peasants were summoned, fought, and sent home to harvest crops. Knights supplied their own armor. Castles were defensive, not expansive. Conflict had natural restrictions because it relied on individuals who still required to exist. Zero treasury could sustain endless conflict because zero treasury had to. If a ruler pushed too far, forces dissolved, food ran out, loyalty fractured. The framework enforced restraint without requiring regulations. Then gunpowder arrived in Europe quietly at first in the late Middle Ages. Initially, it looked unimpressive. Crude cannons were unreliable. Early firearms were slow and inaccurate. Traditional elites dismissed them as noisy curiosities. They were incorrect, but not for the reason most individuals think. Gunpowder didn't matter because it killed knights. It mattered because it killed inexpensive conflict. Cannons transformed siege warfare overnight. Stone walls that had protected cities for centuries crumbled under sustained bombardment. Fortifications had to be redesigned, thicker, lower, angled. That signified engineers, materials, period, currency. Firearms transformed forces. Training a knight took a lifetime. Training a musketeer took months, but only if you could afford the arms, the powder, the supply chain, and the constant resupply. Battles were no longer fought with what soldiers carried on their backs. They were fought with what states could deliver to the front. Conflict ceased being local. It became industrial. Standing forces replaced feudal levies. Soldiers were no longer farmers who fought occasionally. They were professionals who required year-round compensation. Forces no longer disbanded after campaigns. They waited, drilled, consumed resources, even in peace period. Victory no longer went to the bravest. It went to whoever could keep compensating. This was the moment authority began to centralize. Local lords couldn't afford cannons. Modest kingdoms couldn't maintain fortresses. Feudal responsibilities weren't enough to fund continuous conflict. Only centralized states with predictable revenue could survive in this novel reality. Gunpowder didn't merely defeat castles. It defeated decentralization. And once rulers comprehended that conflict now required currency, they confronted a novel difficulty: where to obtain it. Temporary taxes weren't enough. Emergency levies couldn't sustain permanent forces. So states accomplished something radical. They normalized taxation. What had once been occasional became constant. What had once been negotiated became assumed. Subjects didn't merely owe loyalty anymore. They owed currency. But even that wasn't sufficient. Gunpowder conflicts were vast, prolonged, relentless. The expense of cannons, powder, fortifications, vessels, and soldiers exceeded what taxes alone could raise. So, governments transformed to borrowing. This is where the financial framework truly enters the narrative. States began issuing obligation, not as a last resort, but as a strategy. Bonds funded conflicts. Credit became a weapon. Financiers and bankers replaced nobles as the monarch's most important allies. A ruler who could borrow could fight longer than a ruler who couldn't, even if the latter was more beloved. Conflict ceased being restricted by individuals. It became restricted only by credit. And that transformed everything. Once conflicts could be financed, they could be extended beyond public tolerance. Expenses could be spread across decades. Losses could be deferred. Inflation could quietly absorb component of the burden. Entire populations could be mobilized financially without ever touching a battlefield. This is the origin of the contemporary state. Permanent taxation, standing forces, public obligation, centralized power. None of it was invented out of abstract theory. It was invented because gunpowder made conflict too expensive to fight the old manner. The human expense of the shift was enormous. Peasants compensated higher taxes. Wages lagged behind prices. Inflation eroded savings. Obligations outlived monarchs and were passed to generations who had never voted for the conflict or even existed during it. And yet, the framework endured. Because it operated. Gunpowder rewired the expense of conflict. And by accomplishing so, it rewired the relationship between currency and authority forever. Once gunpowder transformed conflict into a permanent expense, states confronted a difficulty they had never encountered at this magnitude. They couldn't compensate for it. Honestly, raising taxes high enough to fund standing forces, fortifications, fleets, and continuous supply chains risked revolt. Borrowing substantial sums risked default, and cutting military spending signified falling behind rivals who were still investing in firepower. So governments accomplished something more subtle. They transformed how the expense of conflict was felt. This is where inflation enters the narrative, not as a coincidence and not as a contemporary invention, but as a structural response to the gunpowder economy. Inflation had existed for centuries. Ancient rulers clipped coins and reduced silver content to survive emergencies. But those episodes were dangerous, short-lived, highly visible, pushed debasement too far, and confidence collapsed immediately. Soldiers refused compensation, markets seized, regimes fell. Gunpowder warfare transformed that calculation. When conflict became permanent, states required a manner to spread its expense quietly, gradually, and across individuals who might never observe the battlefield. Inflation accomplished exactly that. Instead of extracting worth directly through taxes, governments could extract it indirectly by transforming the worth of currency itself. Instead of demanding more from citizens currently, they could demand less for currency tomorrow. The burden didn't disappear. It dissolved. This is the crucial shift. Before gunpowder, inflation resolved occurrences. After gunpowder, inflation assisted manage frameworks. Gunpowder conflicts were not brief shocks. They were sustained drains. Cannons didn't merely require to be constructed once. They required constant replacement. Powder spoiled. Arms wore out. Fortresses required maintenance, even in peace period. Forces consumed resources every day they existed. Taxes alone could not keep up. Obligation bridged the gap. But obligation came with its own difficulty, repayment. Inflation quietly resolved that, too. When prices rise, the genuine worth of obligation falls. Governments learned slowly initially, then deliberately, that modest inflation reduced the burden of past conflicts without forcing explicit defaults. Creditors were repaid in nominal conditions, but with diminished purchasing authority. The political backlash was muted. The mechanism was invisible to most. Conflict financed this manner became socially survivable. This is why inflation becomes persistent in gunpowder-era states. Not explosive, not hyperinflation that still destroys regimes, but steady erosion enough to ease pressure, enough to purchase period, enough to keep the framework functioning. And once this reasoning exists, it doesn't stay confined to conflict. Military spending becomes permanent. Obligation rolls forward. Inflation becomes tolerated, even expected. Financial frameworks evolve around managing these pressures rather than eliminating them. Central authorities gain more control, not less, because coordination is required to keep the framework stable. This is the true legacy of the gunpowder economy. Not merely bigger conflicts, but financialized conflict. Aggression no longer required immediate consent. It required liquidity. Political resistance could be outlasted. Expenses could be postponed. Sacrifice could be generalized rather than targeted. And this reshaped society. Individuals who never fought still compensated. Savings lost worth quietly. Wages lagged prices. Entire generations inherited responsibilities created by conflicts they never voted for. The link between conflict and daily existence weakened. Not because conflict mattered less, but because its expense was diffused. This is why contemporary states feel so durable. Currently, contemporary warfare is no longer restricted by manpower. It's restricted by budgets, aircraft carriers, satellites, cyber frameworks, logistics networks. These are financial commitments as much as military ones. And merely like in the age of gunpowder, the inquiry isn't who fights best, it's who can afford to keep fighting. The uncomfortable truth is that restraint rarely originates from morality alone. It originates from expense. When expense is absorbed, deferred, or disguised through finance, restraint weakens. This doesn't signify conflict is inevitable. It signifies conflict is structural. It exists inside frameworks designed to make it sustainable. And as long as those frameworks exist, the relationship between currency and aggression will remain tight even when the battlefield feels far away. This is why discussions about obligation, inflation, and public finance can never be separated from discussions about authority. These aren't abstract economic concepts. They are instruments that permit states to project force without immediate collapse. They are the legacy of a reality where gunpowder instructed rulers a brutal brutal instruction. Whoever controls finance controls endurance. Comprehending this doesn't require cynicism. It requires realism. So when individuals ask why governments borrow so substantially, why military budgets feel permanent, why inflation quietly erodes savings, or why conflicts seem disconnected from daily existence, the answer isn't hidden in recent headlines. It's buried centuries deep in the moment when technology made aggression too expensive to manage informally. Gunpowder didn't merely transform conflict. It transformed what authority required to exist. The instruction here isn't that technology is dangerous or that finance is corrupt. It's that frameworks evolve around the expenses they must absorb. When those expenses are substantial enough, they reshape everything upstream. Institutions, currency, and the existences existed inside them. History doesn't replicate, but it accomplishes rhyme with brutal consistency. When technology raises the price of authority, currency steps in to bridge the gap. And once that bridge exists, it's rarely dismantled. If this provided you a novel perspective, hit subscribe. History possesses the answers. I'll demonstrate you where to look.